The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 1, Side 2. It was the people who created the fairest flower of the medieval spirit, and made Mary the most beloved figure in history. The population of a recovering Europe could no longer accept the stern picture of a God damning the majority of his creatures to hell, and of their own accord the people softened the terrors of the theologians with the pity of the Mother of Christ. They would approach Jesus, still too sublime and just, through her who refused no one, and whom her Son could not refuse. A youth, says Caesarius of Heisterbach, in 1230, was persuaded by Satan, on the promise of great wealth, to deny Christ, but could not be induced to deny Mary. When he repented, the Virgin persuaded Christ to forgive him. The same monk tells of a Cistercian lay brother who was heard to pray to Christ, "Lord, if thou free me not from this temptation, I will complain of thee to thy mother." Men prayed so much to the Virgin that popular fancy pictured Jesus as jealous. To one who had deluged heaven with Ave Marias he appeared, says a pretty legend, and gently reproached him. "My mother thanks you very much for all the salutations you make to her, but still you should not forget to salute me too." Just as the sternness of Yahweh had necessitated Christ, so the justice of Christ needed Mary's mercy to temper it. In effect, the Mother, the oldest figure in religious worship, became, as Mohammed had prophetically misconceived her, the third person of a new trinity. Everyone joined in her love and praise. Rebels like Abelard bowed to her. Satirists like Rutebeuf, roistering skeptics like the wandering scholars, never ventured one irreverent word about her. Knights vowed themselves to her service, and cities gave her their keys. The rising bourgeoisie saw in her the sanctifying symbol of motherhood and the family. The rough men of the guilds, even the blaspheming heroes of barracks and battlefields, vied with peasant maidens and bereaved mothers in bringing their prayers and gifts to her feet. The most passionate poetry of the Middle Ages was the litany that in mounting fervor proclaimed her glory and besought her aid. Images of her rose everywhere, even at street corners, at crossroads, and in the fields. Finally, in the 12th and 13th centuries, in the noblest birth of religious feeling in history, the poor and the rich, the humble and the great, the clergy and the laity, the artists and the artisans, devoted their savings and their skills to honor her in 1,000 cathedrals, nearly all dedicated to her name, or having as their chief splendor some lady chapel set aside as her shrine. A new religion had been created, and perhaps Catholicism survived by absorbing it. A gospel of Mary took form, uncanonical, incredible, and indescribably charming. The people begot the legends, the monks wrote them down. So the Golden Legend told how a widow surrendered her only son to her country's call. The youth was captured by the enemy. The widow prayed daily to the Virgin to redeem and restore her son. When many weeks passed without response, the woman stole the sculptured child from the Virgin's arms and hid him in her home, whereupon the Virgin opened the prison, released the youth, and bade him, "Tell your mother, my child, to return me my son, now that I have returned hers." About 1230, a French prior, Gaultier de Coincy, gathered the Mary legends into a tremendous poem of 30,000 lines. Therein we find the Virgin curing a sick monk by having him suck milk from her douce mamelle. A robber, who always prayed to her before embarking on his thefts, was caught and hanged, but was supported by her unseen hands until, her protection of him being perceived, he was released. And a nun who left her convent to lead a life of sin returned years later in broken repentance and found that the Virgin, to whom she had never omitted a daily prayer, had all the time filled her place as sacristan, so that none had noted her absence. The Church could not approve of all these stories, but she made great festivals of the events in Mary's life, the Annunciation, the Visitation, the Purification, or Candlemas, the Assumption, and finally, yielding to the appeals of generations of the laity and of Franciscan monks, she allowed the faithful to believe, and in 1854 bade them believe, in the Immaculate Conception, that Mary had been conceived free of that taint of original sin which, in the Christian theology, lay upon every child born of man and woman since Adam and Eve. The worship of Mary transformed Catholicism from a religion of terror, perhaps necessary in the Dark Ages, into a religion of mercy and love. Half the beauty of Catholic worship, much of the splendor of Catholic art and song, are the creation of this gallant faith in the devotion and gentleness, even the physical loveliness and grace, of woman. The daughters of Eve have entered the temple and have transformed its spirit. Partly because of that new Catholicism, feudalism was chastened into chivalry, and the status of woman was moderately raised in a man-made world. Because of it, medieval and Renaissance sculpture and painting gave to art a depth and tenderness rarely known to the Greeks. One can forgive much to a religion and an age that created Mary and her cathedrals. 4. Ritual. In art and hymns and liturgy, the Church wisely made place for the worship of the Virgin, but in the older elements of her practice and ritual she insisted on the sterner and more solemn aspects of the faith. Following ancient customs, and perhaps for reasons of health, she prescribed periodical fasts. All Fridays were to be meatless. Throughout the 40 days of Lent, no meat, eggs, or cheese might be eaten, and the fast was not to be broken till the hour of noon, or 3 p.m. Furthermore, there were to be in that period no weddings, no rejoicing, no hunting, no trials in court, no sexual intercourse. These were counsels of perfection, seldom fully observed or enforced, but they helped to strengthen the will and to tame the excessive appetites of an omnivorous and carnal population. The liturgy of the Church was another ancient inheritance, remolded into lofty and moving forms of religious drama, music, and art. The Psalms of the Old Testament, the prayers and homilies of the Jerusalem Temple, readings from the New Testament, and the administration of the Eucharist constituted the earliest elements of the Christian service. The division of the Church into Eastern and Western resulted in divergent rites, and the inability of the early popes to extend their full authority beyond central Italy resulted in a diversity of ceremony even in the Latin Church. A ritual established at Milan spread to Spain, Gaul, Ireland, and North Britain, and was not overcome by the Roman form till 664. Pope Hadrian I, probably completing labors begun by Gregory I, reformed the liturgy in a sacramentary sent to Charlemagne toward the end of the 8th century. Guillaume Durant wrote the medieval classic on the Roman liturgy in his Rationale Divinorum Officiorum, or Rational Exposition of the Divine Offices, of 1286. We may judge its wide acceptance from the fact that it was the first book printed after the Bible. The center and summit of the Christian worship was the Mass. In the first 4 centuries, this ceremony was called the Eucharist, or Thanksgiving, and that sacramental commemoration of the Last Supper remained the essence of the service. Around it there gathered in the course of 12 centuries a complicated succession of prayers and songs, varying with the day and season of the year and the purpose of the individual Mass, and inscribed for the convenience of the priest in the Missal, or Book of the Mass. In the Greek rite, and sometimes in the Latin, the two sexes were separated in the congregation. There were no chairs, all stood, or, at the most solemn moments, knelt. Exceptions were made for old or weak people, and for monks or canons who had to stand through long services, little ledges were built into the choir stalls to support the base of the spine. These misericordiae, or mercies, became a favorite recipient of the woodcarver's skill. The officiating priest entered in a toga covered by alb, chasuble, maniple, and stole, colorful garments bearing symbolical decorations. The most prominent symbols were usually the letters IHS, that is, Iesos Huios Soter, Jesus, Son of God, Savior. The Mass itself was begun at the foot of the altar with the humble introit, I shall go into the altar of God, to which the acolyte added, To God who giveth joy to my youth. The priest ascended the altar, and kissed it as the sacred repository of saintly relics. He intoned the Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy upon us, a Greek survival in the Latin Mass, and recited the Gloria, glory to the God in the highest, and the Credo. He consecrated little wafers of bread and a chalice of wine into the body and blood of Christ, with the words, Hoc est corpus meum, and Hic est sanguinis meus, and offered these transubstantiated elements, namely his Son, as a propitiatory sacrifice to God in commemoration of the sacrifice on the cross, and in lieu of the ancient sacrifice of living things. Turning to the worshippers, he bade them lift up their hearts to God, sursum corda, to which the acolyte, representing the congregation, answered, Habemus ad Dominum, we hold them up to the Lord. The priest then recited the triple Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, and the Pater Noster. Himself partook of the consecrated bread and wine, and administered the Eucharist to communicants. After some additional prayers, he pronounced the closing formula, Ite missa est, depart, it is dismissal, from which the Mass or Missa probably derived its name. In late forms there still followed a blessing of the congregation by the priest and another gospel reading, usually the Neoplatonic exordium of the Gospel of St. John. Normally there was no sermon except when a bishop officiated, or when, after the 12th century, a friar came to preach. At first all Masses were sung, and the congregation joined in the singing. From the 4th century onward the vocal participation of the worshippers declined, and canonical choristers provided the musical response to the celebrant's chant. The hymns sung in the various services of the Church are among the most moving products of medieval sentiment and art. The known history of the Latin hymn begins with Bishop Hilary of Poitiers, who died in 367. Returning to Gaul from exile in Syria, he brought home some Greco-Oriental hymns, translated them into Latin, and composed some of his own. All of these are lost. Ambrose at Milan made a new beginning. 18 survive of his sonorous hymns, whose restrained fervor so affected Augustine. The noble hymn of faith and thanksgiving, Te Deum Laudamus, formerly ascribed to Ambrose, was probably written by the Romanian bishop Nicetas of Remesiana toward the end of the 4th century. In later centuries, the Latin hymns may have assumed a new delicacy of feeling and form under the influence of Moslem and Provençal love poetry. Some of the hymns, like some Arabic poems, verged on jingling doggerel, tipsy with excess of rhyme, but the better hymns of the medieval flowering, the 12th and 13th centuries, developed a subtle turn of compact phrase, a melodiousness of frequent rhyme, a grace and tenderness of thought that ranked them with the greatest lyrics in literature. To the famous monastery of St. Victor, outside of Paris, there came about 1130 a Breton youth known to us only as Adam of St. Victor. He lived there in quiet content his remaining 60 years, imbibed the spirit of the famous mystics Hugo and Richard, and expressed it humbly, beautifully, and powerfully in hymns mostly designed as sequences for the Mass. A century after him, a Franciscan monk, Jacopone da Todi, who lived possibly from 1228 to 1306, composed the supreme medieval lyric, the Stabat Mater. Jacopone was a successful lawyer in Todi, near Perugia. His wife was known for both goodness and loveliness. She was crushed to death by the fall of a platform at a festival. Jacopone became insane with grief, roamed the Umbrian roads as a wild vagrant crying out his sins and sorrows, smeared himself with tar and feathers and walked on all fours, joined the Franciscan tertiaries, and wrote the poem that sums up the tender piety of his time. The first verse in Latin reads, Stabat mater dolorosa, juxta crucem lacrimosa, dum pendebat filius, cuius animam gementum, contristantem et dolentum, pertransivit gladius. In translation, the entire poem reads, Stood the mother broken-hearted, all in tears before the cross, while her son hung dying. Through her spirit heavy laden, mourning for him and in pain, pierced a sword of grief. Oh, how sad and deep afflicted was that mother, all so blessed of the only son. Wailed she then and sore lamented, trembled when she saw the torture of her noble son. Who is he that would not sorrow if he saw our Saviour's mother in such agony? Who could help but share her sadness, seeing her, the loving mother, grieving with her son? Come, my mother, fount of loving, make me feel your fullest anguish. Let me mourn with you. Let my heart be fired with ardor. Loving Christ our God and Savior, let me please him so. Holy Mother, do this for me. Plant the blows of him so martyred deeply in my heart. Of your offspring sorely wounded, bearing ignominy for me, let me share the pains. Let me truly weep beside you, mourn with you the crucified all my living years. Standing by the cross together, would that I might e'er be with you, gladly bound in grief. Let me by the cross be guarded, saved by Christ's redeeming passion, cherished by his grace. When my body shall have perished, let my soul in heaven's glory see him face to face. Only 2 poems rival this among medieval Christian hymns. One is the Pange Lingua that St. Thomas Aquinas composed for the Corpus Christi feast. The other is the terrible Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, written about 1250 by Thomas of Celano, and still sung in the Mass for the dead. Here the horror of the Last Judgment inspires a poem as dark and perfect as any of Dante's tormented dreams. To the moving ritual of her prayers, hymns, and Mass, the Church added the imposing ceremonies and processions of religious festivals. In northern countries, the Feast of the Nativity took over the pleasant rites wherewith the pagan Teutons had celebrated the victory of the sun, at the winter solstice, over the advancing night. Hence the Yule logs that burned in German, North French, English, Scandinavian homes, and the Yule trees laden with gifts, and the merry feasting that tried strong stomachs till the 12th night thereafter. There were countless other feasts or holy days: Epiphany, Circumcision, Palm Sunday, Easter, Ascension, Pentecost. Such days, and only in less degree all Sundays, were exciting events in the life of medieval man. For Easter he confessed such of his sins as he cared to remember, bathed, cut his beard or hair, dressed in his best and most uncomfortable clothes, received God in the Eucharist, and felt more profoundly than ever the momentous Christian drama of which he was made a part. In many towns, on the last 3 days of Holy Week, the events of the Passion were represented in the churches by a religious play, with dialogue and plain chant, and several other occasions of the ecclesiastical year were signalized with such mysteries. About 1240, Juliana, prioress of a convent near Liège, reported to her village priest that a supernatural vision had urged upon her the need of honoring with a solemn festival the body of Christ as transubstantiated in the Eucharist. In 1262, Pope Urban IV sanctioned such a celebration and entrusted to St. Thomas Aquinas the composition of an office for it, appropriate hymns and prayers. The philosopher acquitted himself wonderfully well in this assignment, and in 1311 the feast of Corpus Christi was finally established and was celebrated on the first Thursday after Pentecost, with the most impressive procession of the Christian year. Such ceremonies drew immense crowds and glorified numerous participants. They opened the way to the medieval secular drama, and they helped the pageantry of the guilds, the tournaments and knightly initiations, and the coronation of kings to occupy with pious flurry and sublimating spectacle the occasional leisure of men not natively inclined to order and peace. The Church based her technique of moralization through faith not on arguments to reason, but on appeals to the senses through drama, music, painting, sculpture, architecture, fiction, and poetry. And it must be confessed that such appeals to universal sensibilities are more successful, for evil as well as for good, than challenges to the changeful and individualistic intellect. Through such appeals, the Church created medieval art. The culminating pageants were at the goals of pilgrimage. Medieval men and women went on pilgrimage to fulfill a penance or a vow, or to seek a miraculous cure, or to earn an indulgence, and, doubtless like modern tourists, to see strange lands and sights, and find adventure on the way as a relief from the routine of a narrow life. At the end of the 13th century there were some 10,000 sanctioned goals of Christian pilgrimage. The bravest pilgrims fared to distant Palestine, sometimes barefoot or clothed only in a shirt, and usually armed with cross, staff, and purse, all given by a priest. In 1054, Bishop Liedbert of Cambrai led 3,000 pilgrims to Jerusalem. In 1064, the archbishops of Cologne and Mainz and the bishops of Speyer, Bamberg, and Utrecht started for Jerusalem with 10,000 Christians in their wake. 3,000 of them perished on the way. Only 2,000 returned safely to their native lands. Other pilgrims crossed the Pyrenees or risked themselves on the Atlantic to visit the reputed bones of the Apostle James at Compostela in Spain. In England, pilgrims sought the tomb of St. Cuthbert at Durham, the grave of Edward the Confessor in Westminster, or that of St. Edmund at Bury. The church supposedly founded by Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury, and above all the shrine of Thomas à Becket at Canterbury. France drew pilgrims to St. Martin's at Tours, to Notre Dame at Chartres, Notre Dame at Le Puy-en-Velay. Italy had the church and bones of St. Francis at Assisi, and the Santa Casa, or Holy House, at Loreto, which the pious believed to be the very dwelling in which Mary had lived with Jesus at Nazareth. When the Turks drove the last crusader from Palestine, this cottage was carried by angels through the air and deposited in Dalmatia in 1291, then flown across the Adriatic to the Ancona Woods, or Lauretum, from which the honored village took its name. Finally, all the roads of Christendom led pilgrims to Rome, to see the tombs of Peter and Paul, to earn indulgences by visiting the stations or famous churches of the city, or to celebrate some jubilee or joyous anniversary in Christian history. In 1299, Pope Boniface VIII declared a jubilee for 1300 and offered a plenary indulgence to those who should come and worship in St. Peter's in that year. It was estimated that on no day in those 12 months had Rome less than 200,000 strangers within her gates, and a total of 2 million visitors, each with a modest offering, deposited such treasure before St. Peter's tomb that 2 priests, with rakes in their hands, were kept busy night and day collecting the coins. Guidebooks taught the pilgrims by what roads to travel and what points to visit at their goal or on the way. We may weakly imagine the exultation of the tired and dusty pilgrims when at last they sighted the eternal city and burst into the pilgrims' chorus of joy and praise. O noble Rome, of all this world the queen, of all the cities the most excellent, O ruby red with martyrs' rosy blood, yet white with lilies pure of virgin maids, we give thee salutation through all years. We bless thee, through all generations hail. To these varied religious services, the Church added social services. She taught the dignity of labor and practiced it through the agriculture and industry of her monks. She sanctified the organization of labor in the guilds and organized religious guilds to perform works of charity. Every church was a sanctuary with right of asylum in which hunted men might find some breathless refuge till the passions of their pursuers could yield to the processes of law. To drag men from such a sanctuary was a sacrilege entailing excommunication. The church or cathedral was the social as well as the religious center of the town or village. Sometimes the sacred precinct, or even the church itself, was used, with genial clerical consent, to store grain or hay or wine, to grind corn or brew beer. There most of the villagers had been baptized. There most of them would be buried. There the older folk would gather of a Sunday for gossip or discussion, and the young men and women to see and be seen. There the beggars assembled, and the alms of the church were dispensed. There nearly all the art that the village knew was brought together to beautify the house of God, and the poverty of 1,000 homes was brightened by the glory of that temple which the people had built with their coins and hands, and which they considered their own, their collective and spiritual home. In the church belfry the bells rang the hours of the day or the call to services and prayer, and the music of those bells was sweeter than any other except the hymns that bound voices and hearts into one, or warmed a cooling faith with the canticles of the Mass. From Novgorod to Cadiz, from Jerusalem to the Hebrides, steeples and spires raised themselves precariously into the sky, because men cannot live without hope, and will not consent to die. 5. Canon Law. Side by side with this complex and colorful liturgy, there developed the even more complex body of ecclesiastical legislation that regulated the conduct and decisions of a church governing a wider and more varied realm than any empire of the time. Canon law, the law of the rule of the church, was a slow accretion of old religious customs, scriptural passages, opinions of the fathers, laws of Rome or the barbarians, the decrees of church councils, and the decisions and opinions of the popes. Some parts of the Justinian Code were adapted to govern the conduct of the clergy. Other parts were recast to accord with the views of the Church on marriage, divorce, and wills. Collections of ecclesiastical legislation were made in the 6th and 8th centuries in the West, and periodically by Byzantine emperors in the East. The laws of the Roman Church received their definitive medieval formulation by Gratian, about 1140. As a monk of Bologna, Gratian may have studied under Irnerius in the university there. Certainly his digest shows a wide acquaintance with both Roman law and medieval philosophy. He called his book Concordia Discordantium Canonum, reconciliation of discordant regulations. Later generations called it his Decretum. It drew into order and sequence the laws and customs, the conciliar and papal decrees of the Church down to 1139 on her doctrine, ritual, organization, and administration, the maintenance of ecclesiastical property, the procedure and precedence of ecclesiastical courts, the regulation of monastic life, the contract of marriage, and the rules of bequest. The method of exposition may have stemmed from Abelard's sic et non, and had in turn some influence on scholastic method after Gratian. It began with an authoritative proposition, quoted statements or precedents contradicting it, sought to resolve the contradiction, and added a commentary. Though the book was not accepted by the medieval church as a final authority, it became, for the period it covered, the indispensable and almost sacred text. Gregory IX in 1234, Boniface VIII in 1294, and Clement V in 1313 added supplements. These and some minor additions were published with Gratian's Concordia in 1582 as Corpus Juris Canonici, a body of canonical, church-regulating law comparable with the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian. Indeed, the field covered by canon law was larger than that covered by any contemporary civil code. It embraced not merely the structure, dogmas, and operation of the Church, but rules for dealing with non-Christians in Christian lands, procedure in the investigation and suppression of heresy, the organization of crusades, the laws of marriage, legitimacy, dower, adultery, divorce, wills, burial, widows, and orphans, laws of oath, perjury, sacrilege, blasphemy, simony, libel, usury, and just price, regulations for schools and universities, the truce of God and other means of limiting war and organizing peace, the conduct of episcopal and papal courts, the use of excommunication, anathema, and interdict, the administration of ecclesiastical penalties, the relations between civil and ecclesiastical courts, between state and church. This vast body of legislation was held by the Church to be binding on all Christians, and she reserved the right to punish any infraction of it with a variety of physical or spiritual penalties, except that no ecclesiastical court was to pronounce a judgment of blood, that is, condemned to capital punishment. Usually, before the Inquisition, the Church relied on spiritual terrors. Minor excommunication excluded a Christian from the sacraments and ritual of the Church. Any priest could pronounce this penalty, and to believers it meant everlasting hell if death should reach the offender before absolution came. A major excommunication, the only kind now used by the Church, could be pronounced only by councils or by prelates higher than a priest, and only upon persons within their jurisdiction. It removed the victim from all legal or spiritual association with the Christian community. He could not sue or inherit or do any valid act in law, but he could be sued, and no Christian was to eat or talk with him on pain of minor excommunication. When King Robert of France was excommunicated in 998 for marrying his cousin, he was abandoned by all his courtiers and nearly all his servants. 2 domestics who remained threw into the fire the victuals left by him at his meals, lest they be contaminated by them. In extreme cases, the Church added to excommunication anathema, a curse armed and detailed with all the careful pleonasm of legal phraseology. As a last resort, the Pope could lay an interdict upon any part of Christendom, that is, suspend all or most religious services. A people feeling the need of the sacraments, and fearful of death supervening upon unforgiven sins, sooner or later compelled the excommunicated individual to make his peace with the Church. Such interdicts were laid upon France in 998, Germany in 1102, England in 1208, Rome itself in 1155. The excessive use of excommunication and interdict weakened their effectiveness after the 11th century. Popes employed interdict now and then for political purposes, as when Innocent II threatened Pisa with interdict if it did not join the Tuscan League. Wholesale excommunications, for example for false returns of tithes due the Church, were so numerous that large sections of the Christian community were outlawed at once or without knowing it. And many who knew it ignored the curse or laughed it off. Milan, Bologna, and Florence thrice received wholesale excommunications in the 13th and 14th centuries. Milan ignored the third edict for 22 years. Said Bishop Guillaume Le Maire in 1311, "I have sometimes seen with my own eyes 300 or 400 excommunicates in a single parish, and even 700 who despised the power of the keys and uttered blasphemous and scandalous words against the Church and her ministers." Philip Augustus and Philip the Fair paid little attention to the decrees that excommunicated them. Such occasional indifference marked the beginning of a decline in the authority of canon law over the laity of Europe. As the Church had taken so wide an area of human life under her rule when, in the first Christian millennium, secular powers had broken down, so in the 13th and 14th centuries, as secular government grew stronger, one phase after another of human affairs was recaptured by civil from canon law. The Church properly won in the matter of ecclesiastical appointments. In most other fields her authority began to decline, in education, marriage, morals, economy, and war. The states that had grown up under the protection and by the permission of the social order that she had created declared themselves of age and began that long process of secularization which culminates today. But the work of the canonists, like most creative activity, was not lost. It prepared and trained the Church's greatest statesmen. It shared in transmitting Roman law to the modern world. It raised the legal rights of widows and children and established the principle of dower in the civil law of Western Europe. And it helped to shape the form and terms of scholastic philosophy. Canon law was among the major achievements of the medieval mind. 6. The clergy. Medieval parlance divided all persons into two classes, those who lived under a religious rule and those who lived in the world. A monk was a religious, so was a nun. Some monks were also priests, and constituted the regular clergy, that is, clergy following a monastic rule or regula. All other clergy were called secular, as living in the world, or seculum. All ranks of clergy were distinguished by the tonsure, a shaven crown of the head, and wore a long robe, of any single color but red or green, buttoned from head to foot. The term clergy included not only those in minor orders, that is, church doorkeepers, readers, exorcists, and acolytes, but all university students, all teachers, and all who, having taken the tonsure as students, later became physicians, lawyers, artists, authors, or served as accountants or literary aides. Hence the later narrowing of the terms clerical and clerk. Clerics who had not taken major orders were allowed to marry, and to take up any respectable profession, and they were under no obligation to continue the tonsure. The three major or holy orders, subdeacon, deacon, priest, were irrevocable and generally closed the door to marriage after the 11th century. Instances of marriage or concubinage in the Latin priesthood after Gregory VII are recorded, but they become more and more exceptional. The parish priest had to content himself with spiritual joys. As the parish was normally coterminous with a manor or a village, he was usually appointed by the lord of the manor in collusion with the bishop. He was seldom a man of much schooling, for a university education was costly and books were rare. It was enough if he could read the breviary and the missal, administer the sacraments, and organize the parish for worship and charity. In many cases he was only a vicarius, a vicar or substitute, hired by a rector to do the religious work of the parish for a fourth of the revenues of the benefice. In this way one rector might hold 4 or 5 benefices, while the parish priest lived in humble poverty, eking out his income with altar fees for baptisms, marriages, burials, and masses for the dead. Sometimes in the class war he sided with the poor, like John Ball. His morals could not compare with those of the modern priest, who has been put on his best behavior by religious competition, but by and large he did his work with patience, conscience, and kindliness. He visited the sick, comforted the bereaved, taught the young, mumbled his breviary, and brought some moral and civilizing leaven to a rough and lusty population. Many parish priests said their cruelest critic were the salt of the earth. "No other body of men," said the free-thinking Lecky, "have ever exhibited a more single-minded and unworldly zeal, refracted by no personal interests, sacrificing to duty the dearest of earthly objects, and confronting with dauntless heroism every form of hardship, of suffering, and of death." Priesthood and episcopate constituted the sacerdotium, or sacerdotal order. The bishop was a priest selected to coordinate several parishes and priests into one diocese. Originally and theoretically he was chosen by priests and people. Usually, before Gregory VII, he was named by the baron or king. After 1215 he was elected by the cathedral chapter in cooperation with the pope. To his care were committed many secular as well as ecclesiastical affairs, and his episcopal court tried some civil cases as well as all those involving clergy of any rank. He had the power to appoint and depose priests, but his authority over the abbots and monasteries in his diocese diminished in this period, as the popes, fearing the power of the bishops, brought the monastic orders under direct papal control. His revenues came partly from his parishes, mostly from the estates attached to his see. Sometimes he gave more to a parish than he received from it. Candidates for a bishopric usually agreed to pay, at first to the king, later to the pope, a fee for their nomination, and as secular rulers they sometimes yielded to the amiable weakness of appointing relatives to lucrative posts. Pope Alexander III complained that when God deprived bishops of sons, the devil gave them nephews. Many bishops lived in luxury, as became feudal lords, but many were consumed in devotion to their spiritual and administrative tasks. After the reform of the episcopate by Leo IX, the bishops of Europe were, in mind and morals, the finest body of men in medieval history. Above the bishops of a province stood the archbishop or metropolitan. He alone could call or preside over a provincial council of the Church. Some archbishops, by their character or their wealth, ruled nearly all the life of their provinces. In Germany, the archbishops of Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, Trier, Mainz, Magdeburg, and Salzburg were powerful feudal lords who were in several instances chosen by the emperors to administer the empire or to serve as ambassadors or royal counselors. The archbishops of Reims, Rouen, and Canterbury played a similar role in France, Normandy, and England. Certain archbishops of Toledo, Lyon, Narbonne, Reims, Cologne, Canterbury were made primates and exercised a debated authority over all the ecclesiastics of their region. The bishops gathered in council constituted periodically a representative government for the Church. In later centuries, these councils would lay claim to powers superior to those of the Pope. But in this, the age of the greatest pontiffs, no one in Western Europe questioned the supreme ecclesiastical and spiritual authority of the Bishop of Rome. The scandals of the 10th century had been atoned for by the virtues of Leo IX and Hildebrand. Amid the oscillations and struggles of the 12th century, the power of the papacy had grown until, in Innocent III, it claimed to overspread the earth. Kings and emperors held the stirrup and kissed the feet of the white-robed servant of the servants of God. The papacy was now the highest reach of human ambition. The finest minds of the time prepared themselves in rigorous schools of theology and law for a place in the hierarchy of the Church, and those who rose to the top were men of intelligence and courage, who were not appalled by the task of governing a continent. Their individual deaths hardly disturbed the pursuit of the policies formed by them and their councils. What Gregory VII left unfinished, Innocent III completed, and Innocent IV and Alexander IV carried to a victorious end the struggle that Innocent III and Gregory IX had fought against imperial encirclement of the papacy. In theory, the authority of the Pope was derived from his succession to the power conferred upon the apostles by Christ. In this sense, the government of the Church was a theocracy, a government of the people through religion by the earthly vicars of God. In another sense, the Church was a democracy. Every man in Christendom except the mentally or physically defective, the convicted criminal, the excommunicate, and the slave was eligible to the priesthood and the papacy. As in every system, the rich had superior opportunities to prepare themselves for the long hierarchical climb, but career was open to all, and talent, not ancestry, chiefly determined success. Hundreds of bishops and several popes came from the ranks of the poor. This flow of fresh blood into the hierarchy from every rank continually nourished the intelligence of the clergy and was for ages the only practical recognition of the equality of man. In 1059, as we have seen, the right to select the pope was confined to cardinal bishops stationed near Rome. These 7 cardinals were gradually increased, by papal appointment from various nations, to a sacred college of 70 members, who were marked off by their red caps and purple robes, and constituted a new rank in the hierarchy, second only to the Pope himself. Aided by such men and by a large staff of ecclesiastics and other officials constituting the papal curia, or executive and judicial court, the Pope governed a spiritual empire which in the 13th century was at the height of its curve. He alone could summon a general council of the bishops, and their legislation had no force except when confirmed by his decree. He was free to interpret, revise, and extend the canon law of the Church, and to grant dispensations from its rules. He was the final court of appeals from the decisions of episcopal courts. He alone could absolve from certain grave sins, or issue major indulgences, or canonize a saint. After 1059, all bishops had to swear obedience to him, and submit to supervision of their affairs by legates of the Pope. Islands like Sardinia and Sicily, nations like England, Hungary, and Spain acknowledged him as their feudal lord and sent him tribute. Through bishops, priests, and monks, his eyes and hands could be on every part of his realm. These men constituted a service of intelligence and administration with which no state could compete. Gradually, subtly, the rule of Rome was restored over Europe by the astonishing power of the Word. 7. The Papacy Supreme, 1085 to 1294. The conflict between church and state over lay investitures did not die with Gregory VII and the apparent triumph of the empire. It continued for a generation through several pontificates, and reached a compromise in the Concordat of Worms in 1122 between Pope Calixtus II and the Emperor Henry V. Henry surrendered to the Church all investiture by ring and staff, and agreed that elections of bishops and abbots shall be conducted canonically, that is, be made by the affected clergy or monks, and shall be free from all interference and simony. Calixtus conceded that in Germany the elections of bishops or abbots holding lands from the crown should be held in the presence of the king. that in disputed elections the king might decide between the contenders after consulting with the bishops of the province, and that an abbot or bishop holding lands from the king should render to him all feudal obligations due from vassal to suzerain. Similar agreements had already been signed for England and France. Each side claimed the victory. The Church had made substantial progress toward autonomy, but the feudal nexus continued to give the kings a predominant voice in the choice of bishops everywhere in Europe. In 1130 the College of Cardinals divided into factions. One chose Innocent II, the other Anacletus II. Anacletus, though of the noble family of the Pierleoni, had had a Jewish grandfather, a convert to Christianity. His opponents called him Judeo-Pontifex, and St. Bernard, who on other occasions was friendly to the Jews, wrote to the Emperor Lothair II that, "To the shame of Christ, a man of Jewish origin has come to occupy the chair of St. Peter," forgetting Peter's origin. The greater part of the clergy, and all but one of Europe's kings, upheld Innocent. The populace of Europe amused itself with slanders charging Anacletus with incest, and with plundering Christian churches to enrich his Jewish friends. But the people of Rome supported him till his death, in 1138. It was probably the story of Anacletus that led to the 14th-century legend of Andreas the Jewish Pope. Hadrian IV, from 1154 to 1159, exemplified again the ecclesiastical carrière ouverte au talent. Born in England of lowly parentage, and coming as a beggar to a monastery, Nicholas Breakspear raised himself by pure ability to be abbot, cardinal, and pope. He bestowed Ireland upon Henry II of England, compelled Barbarossa to kiss his feet, and almost maneuvered the great emperor into conceding the right of the popes to dispose of royal thrones. When Hadrian died, a majority of cardinals chose Alexander III, from 1159 to 1181. A minority chose Victor IV. Barbarossa, thinking to restore the power once held by German emperors over the papacy, invited both men to lay their claims before him. Alexander refused, Victor agreed, and at the Synod of Pavia in 1160, Barbarossa recognized Victor as pope. Alexander excommunicated Frederick, released the emperor's subjects from civil obedience, and helped revolt in Lombardy. The victory of the Lombard League at Legnano in 1176 humbled Frederick. He made his peace with Alexander at Venice, and once more kissed papal feet. The same pontiff compelled Henry II of England to repair barefoot to the tomb of Becket, and there received discipline from the canons of Canterbury. It was Alexander's long struggle and complete victory that made straight the way for one of the greatest popes. Innocent III was born at Anagni, near Rome, in 1161. As Lothario dei Conti, son of the Count of Segni, he had all the advantages of aristocratic birth and cultured rearing. He studied philosophy and theology at Paris, canon and civil law at Bologna. Back in Rome, by his mastery of both diplomacy and doctrine, and his influential connections, he advanced rapidly on the ecclesiastical ladder. At 30 he was a cardinal deacon. At 37, though still not a priest, he was unanimously chosen pope, this in 1198. He was ordained on one day and consecrated on the next. It was his good fortune that the Emperor Henry VI, who had acquired control of South Italy and Sicily, had died in 1197, leaving the throne to the 3-year-old Frederick II. Innocent seized the opportunity vigorously, deposed the German prefect in Rome, ousted the German feudatories from Spoleto and Perugia, received the submission of Tuscany, re-established the rule of the papacy in the Papal States, was recognized by Henry's widow as overlord of the two Sicilies, and consented to be the guardian of her son. In 10 months, Innocent had made himself master of Italy. He had, on the existing evidence, the best mind of his time. This book is continued on Cassette 2, Side 1.